Under a frost-kissed Montana dawn, where tall grasses shimmer like scattered diamonds and ancient pines murmur forgotten secrets, something astonishing unfolded that challenged everything scientists thought they knew about wildlife. At 73 years old, Daphne Hankins had dedicated her entire life to rescuing wildcats. Yet nothing prepared her for the night when a mysterious visitor appeared outside her window. A rare, elusive bobcat that defied nature itself by seeking out human contact. But why had this wild creature, known for its fierce independence, returned after years in the wild? What secret bond linked this predator to an aging woman living alone at the edge of the forest? When scientists unraveled the truth behind their extraordinary connection, it shattered expectations and revealed a deeper, hidden world, where compassion, memory, and nature intertwined in ways no one could ever have imagined. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories.
The Montana morning dawned crisp and clear, frost glittering on the tall grasses surrounding High Ridge Wildlife Sanctuary. Daphne Hankins moved slowly these days, her 73-year-old bones protesting against the cold that seeped through her heavy wool coat. Still, she wouldn't have missed her morning rounds for anything. Every day for the past 22 years, she'd walked the perimeter of the sanctuary, checking fences and surveying the landscape that had become her life's work. "Coffee's ready when you get back," called Miguel, her assistant of 15 years. He was technically the sanctuary's veterinary technician, but had become much more, a dear friend and, increasingly, her right hand as age made certain tasks more challenging. Daphne raised her walking stick in acknowledgement without turning. She preferred these morning walks alone, savoring the stillness before the day's work began. The sanctuary housed 12 permanent residents, bobcats, lynx, and the occasional mountain lion that couldn't be returned to the wild, and usually had another 8 to 10 animals in various stages of rehabilitation. The sun climbed higher as she made her way along the familiar path, casting long shadows through the ponderosa pines. It had been an unusually mild winter by Montana standards, but February could still surprise them with a blizzard. Daphne paused at a clearing that overlooked the valley below, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. This vista never failed to remind her why she'd chosen this life. The land spread out before her, 500 acres of protected wilderness that served as a buffer between the sanctuary and the encroaching development from Bozeman's outskirts. Beyond lay the jagged profiles of the Bridger Mountains, their peaks still snow-capped even as spring approached. As she stood there, memories washed over her like gentle waves. The trip to that small zoo outside Bozeman when she was just 8 years old, where she'd first locked eyes with a bobcat and felt something shift inside her. The arguments with her parents when, at 22, she'd turned down the prestigious Johns Hopkins medical scholarship to work with wildlife instead. The first time she met David Black at a conservation conference in Denver, his passion for wildcats matching her own. "Penny for your thoughts," David used to say when he'd find her lost in contemplation like this. The familiar ache of his absence squeezed her heart. 17 years together hadn't been nearly enough. The accident had been quick, black ice on a mountain road, a guardrail that failed to hold, but the aftermath stretched on endlessly. For months after his death, Daphne had questioned everything. What was the point of continuing their work without him? But the animals had needed her, and slowly, caring for them had healed something inside her. Not completely. There would always be a David-shaped hole in her heart, but enough to keep going, enough to establish High Ridge officially as a non-profit sanctuary dedicated primarily to bobcats and other native Montana wildcats. A rustle in the underbrush pulled Daphne from her reverie. She instinctively went still, eyes scanning the tree line. Working with wild animals for over 4 decades had taught her the value of patience and observation. Nothing moved for several long moments. Then, a flicker of movement caught her eye, the distinctive tufted ears of a bobcat appearing briefly before vanishing back into the brush. Daphne smiled to herself. Bobcat sightings around the sanctuary weren't uncommon, but they always felt like a gift. Wild bobcats occasionally patrolled the boundaries of the sanctuary, drawn perhaps by the scent of their captive counterparts or simply passing through on their territorial rounds. "Go well, friend," she murmured, turning to continue her walk. The path curved around the eastern edge of the property, where the rehabilitation enclosures were situated far from the visitor center and daily human activity. As she walked, Daphne felt the familiar twinge in her left hip, a souvenir from a fall 3 winters ago. Dr. Mitchell kept telling her she should consider a hip replacement, but Daphne brushed off the suggestion. Surgery meant weeks away from the sanctuary, and she wasn't ready for that. Not yet. By the time she completed her circuit and approached the main buildings, the sanctuary was coming to life. 2 volunteer cars were parked in the small lot, and she could see Jessie, their education coordinator, preparing materials for a school group that would arrive later that morning. The sanctuary hosted educational programs twice weekly, teaching local children about wildlife conservation and the importance of protecting Montana's native species. "Morning, Daphne," Jessie called, her breath visible in the cold air. "Did you see the weather report? They're saying snow by tonight." "My hip's been telling me the same thing," Daphne replied with a wry smile. "Make sure the generator's fueled up, just in case." Inside the main cabin that served as both residence and headquarters, Miguel had indeed prepared coffee. The rich aroma filled the warm space, and Daphne gratefully shed her outer layers before wrapping her hands around a steaming mug. "Any problems on the perimeter?" Miguel asked, not looking up from the medication chart he was updating. "All quiet. Spotted a wild bobcat on the east ridge, though." Miguel glanced up, interest flickering across his face. "Male or female?" "Didn't get a good look. Just saw the ears." Daphne settled into her chair by the wood stove, feeling the heat begin to thaw her chilled limbs. Could have been anyone. But even as she said it, a thought nagged at her mind. There had been something about the way the bobcat moved, something vaguely familiar that she couldn't quite place. The sanctuary had been Daphne's life for so long that memories sometimes blurred together. Hundreds of animals rescued, rehabilitated, released. But some stood out with crystal clarity. Kamba was one of those. They'd found him 15 years ago, a tiny, half-starved bobcat kitten no more than 4 weeks old. A logging crew had discovered him alone in a hollow tree, no mother in sight. They'd called the sanctuary immediately, and David had driven out to collect the orphan. "He's so small," Daphne had whispered when David placed the hissing bundle of spotted fur into her gloved hands. The kitten's eyes, blue-gray and fierce despite his weakness, had fixed on her face with what seemed like indignation at his circumstances. "But he's a fighter," David had replied, gently stroking the tiny head with one finger. "See how he's still got some spirit? That's good." They'd named him Kamba, after the Swahili word for fierce, a nod to David's years working in wildlife conservation in Kenya before returning to his native Montana. The name had suited the little bobcat, who had rallied from near death with a determination that impressed even the sanctuary's veteran staff. Raising Kamba had been different from their usual rehabilitation cases. Most orphan bobcats came to them a bit older, already wary of humans, and with some innate survival skills intact. But Kamba's extreme youth meant he needed more intensive care, bottle feeding every few hours, careful monitoring, and eventually specialized training to ensure he developed the hunting skills he would need in the wild. "We have to be so careful," Daphne had reminded the staff repeatedly. "He can't associate humans with food or comfort, not if he's going to make it out there." But despite their careful protocols, the minimal handling, the hiding of human faces behind masks during feedings, the gradual introduction of live prey, Kamba had formed an unusual connection with Daphne. He never approached her like a pet might, never sought affection or played, but he watched her with an intensity that the other rehabilitating animals didn't show. "He's imprinted on you," Miguel had suggested once, about 6 months into Camba's rehabilitation. Daphne had shaken her head firmly. "No, he's too independent for that. He's just observant." And she had been right. As Camba grew, he maintained his wild nature. He hissed when approached too closely, hunted with impressive precision in his training exercises, and showed all the territorial behaviors appropriate for a young male bobcat. But still, there was that awareness, that peculiar focus on Daphne whenever she was near. David had noticed it too. "It's like he's studying you," he'd said one evening, as they observed Camba from the hidden monitoring station outside his enclosure. Learning. When Camba turned 18 months old, healthy and skilled enough for release, Daphne had experienced a profound sense of loss that took her by surprise. They'd released dozens of rehabilitated animals before, each departure a bittersweet triumph. But Camba's release had felt different. They'd chosen a remote area in the Gallatin National Forest, miles from roads and human habitation, but with ideal bobcat habitat, dense underbrush, plentiful prey, and natural shelter. David had carried the transport cage deep into the forest, with Daphne following behind, her heart heavy in her chest. When they finally opened the cage door, Camba had hesitated, sniffing the air cautiously. Then he'd turned his head, his yellow-gold eyes finding Daphne's one last time. The look had lasted only seconds, but Daphne felt as though something significant had passed between them. Not affection or gratitude, nothing so human, but a recognition, an acknowledgement. Then he was gone, a spotted shadow melting seamlessly into the forest understory. "He'll be all right," David had assured her, squeezing her hand as they hiked back to their truck. "That one was born to be wild." "I know," Daphne had replied, blinking back unexpected tears. "I just hope he remembers what we taught him." David had laughed softly. "Trust me, that cat doesn't forget anything." 2 years later, David was gone, victim to that icy mountain road and a faulty guardrail. In the depths of her grief, Daphne had sometimes found herself thinking of Camba, wondering if he was thriving in his wild freedom, if the lessons they'd taught him had served him well. Now, 15 years since his release, Daphne rarely thought of Camba specifically. There had been so many others since, each special in their own way, each carrying a piece of her heart into the wilderness when they left. Still, on cold mornings like this one, certain memories surfaced unbidden. "Earth to Daphne." Miguel's voice broke through her thoughts. "You're a million miles away today." She smiled apologetically. "Just remembering." Miguel nodded, understanding in his eyes. He'd joined the sanctuary a few years after David's death, but he'd heard all the stories, seen all the photographs. He knew how deeply the history of this place was etched into Daphne's soul. "The school group will be here in an hour," he reminded her. And Marissa called. "The injured lynx they found near Yellowstone is stable enough for transport. They're bringing her in this afternoon." Daphne nodded, mentally rearranging the day's tasks to accommodate the new arrival. At 73, she no longer handled the more physical aspects of animal care, but she still oversaw every admission, every treatment plan, every release decision. The sanctuary was her life's work, and though she'd begun training Jessie to eventually take over when she could no longer manage, that day had not yet come. The morning passed in a flurry of activity. The school group, 28 fourth graders from Bozeman Elementary, arrived precisely at 10, bubbling with excitement despite their teachers' attempts to maintain order. Daphne welcomed them in the Education Center, a spacious room with displays about Montana's native wildcats and the threats they faced. "Who can tell me what makes a bobcat different from your cat at home?" she asked, smiling as dozens of hands shot into the air. For the next hour, she answered questions, explained the sanctuary's work, and supervised as Jessie led small groups to the observation areas where they could safely view some of the permanent residents. The children were enthralled, especially by Samson, an elderly bobcat with one eye who had been at the sanctuary for 12 years after being rescued from an illegal exotic pet situation. "He looks so soft," one little girl exclaimed, pressing her nose against the viewing glass. "Can we pet him?" "No, honey," Daphne explained gently. "Even though Samson has lived here a long time, he's still a wild animal, not a pet. We never touch the animals unless they're sick and need our help. That's how we show them respect." The girl nodded solemnly, clearly taking this lesson to heart. These moments were what kept Daphne going. The chance to instill in a new generation the same reverence for wildlife that had shaped her own life. After the school group departed, Daphne retreated to her small office to catch up on paperwork. Grant applications never wrote themselves, unfortunately, and the sanctuary's operating costs increased every year. She was deep in concentration when a knock at her door announced Miguel's presence. "Marissa's here with the lynx," he said. "She's in pretty rough shape, hit by a car on the highway near the park entrance. Multiple fractures, possible internal bleeding." Daphne nodded grimly and followed him to the medical building. Wildlife rehabilitation was not for the faint of heart. For every success story, there were animals they couldn't save despite their best efforts. The young female lynx lay sedated on the examination table, her beautiful coat matted with blood and road grime. Dr. Ellie Chun, the veterinarian who came to the sanctuary twice weekly and for emergencies, was already assessing the damage. "Good news is, her spine seems intact," Dr. Chun reported. "Bad news, compound fracture of the left hind leg, 3 broken ribs, and I'm concerned about her right lung. She's going to need surgery, and even then, her chances are maybe 50-50. Daphne studied the injured cat, noting her youth, probably just 2 years old, in good muscle condition before the accident. She deserves that chance, Daphne decided. Let's proceed with surgery. The next few hours were a tense blur of activity as Dr. Chen operated, with Miguel and Marissa assisting and Daphne monitoring vital signs. By the time they transferred the still unconscious lynx to a recovery enclosure, the short winter day was fading toward dusk, and fat snowflakes had begun falling just as the weather report had predicted. "You should head home before the roads get bad," Daphne told Dr. Chun as they cleaned up the surgical area. "Miguel and I will monitor her overnight. Call me if anything changes," the veterinarian instructed, already pulling on her heavy coat. "And Daphne, get some rest yourself. You look exhausted." Daphne waved away the concern. "I'll sleep when she's stable." After Dr. Chun and Marissa had departed, Miguel insisted on making dinner. They ate simple sandwiches in the main cabin, both too tired for conversation. The snow continued falling, blanketing the sanctuary in deepening white. By the time they'd checked on the lynx again, still unconscious but with stable vital signs, the world outside had transformed into a winter wonderland, tree branches heavy with snow and all human sounds muffled by the thick blanket of white. "I'll take first watch," Miguel offered. "You get some sleep, and I'll wake you at 2. Too tired to argue, Daphne retreated to her small bedroom in the back of the cabin. She didn't bother changing out of her clothes, just kicked off her boots and lay atop the quilt, intending to rest her eyes for just a moment before properly preparing for bed. She woke with a start several hours later, momentarily disoriented in the dark room. A glance at her bedside clock showed 1:47 a.m. Something had awakened her, but it wasn't Miguel. It wasn't yet time for her shift with the injured lynx. Then she heard it again, a strange scraping sound at her window. Daphne sat up slowly, her heart suddenly pounding. The sanctuary's remote location meant they occasionally had unwelcome nighttime visitors. Not the human kind, but bears, mountain lions, or other wildlife drawn by the sense of the animals in their care. Usually, the tall perimeter fences kept larger predators out, but in deep snow, sometimes drifts formed that allowed animals to climb over. The scraping came again, followed by a soft thump against the glass. Not a bear. Then, too controlled, too deliberate. Careful not to make sudden movements, Daphne reached for the flashlight she kept beside her bed. The curtains were drawn across her window, preventing her from seeing what was outside. Moving quietly, she slid from the bed and approached the window, flashlight gripped tightly in her hand. In one swift motion, she pulled back the curtain and shone the light out into the snowy night. A pair of gleaming eyes reflected the beam back at her, set in the distinctive face of a bobcat perched on the narrow windowsill outside her room. The animal didn't flinch from the sudden light, didn't hiss or retreat. It simply stared at her with an unervingly steady gaze. Daphne's breath caught in her throat. The bobcat was large for its species, a healthy male in his prime with the characteristic spotted coat and tufted ears. A wild bobcat, not one of their residents. He must have climbed the snow drift against the cabin wall to reach the window. But why would a wild bobcat approach a human dwelling so deliberately? As she stood frozen in confusion, the bobcat raised one paw and deliberately pressed it against the glass, leaving a perfect print in the condensation that had formed there. The gesture was so unexpected, so seemingly intentional, that Daphne gasped aloud. And in that moment of shock, a possibility flashed through her mind that seemed simultaneously impossible and the only explanation. "Kamba?" she whispered, her voice barely audible even to herself. At the sound, the bobcat's ears twitched forward. He tilted his head slightly, eyes never leaving hers. Then he placed his paw against the glass once more, holding it there as snowflakes swirled around him in the night air. Daphne's hands trembled as she fumbled to unlock the window. It couldn't be. It was too unlikely, too fantastic. Bobcats in the wild typically lived 8 to 12 years. If this was Kamba, he would be around 16, elderly for his species, though not impossibly so. And what were the chances he would remember her, remember this place after all these years? Yet as she carefully raised the window a few inches, letting in a gust of frigid air, she knew with sudden certainty that this was indeed Kamba. There was something in the set of his shoulders, something in the fearless, appraising look he gave her that resonated with her memories of the orphaned kitten they had raised so carefully to be wild. "Kamba," she said again, this time with conviction. "You came back." The bobcat made no sound, but his nostrils flared as he scented the air coming from her room. He remained perfectly balanced on the narrow sill, seemingly untroubled by the precarious perch or the falling snow. Daphne stood very still, afraid any movement might send him running. Bobcats were solitary creatures by nature, avoiding human contact whenever possible. Even those raised in captivity maintained their wild instincts and wariness. For a wild bobcat to seek out human presence this way was virtually unheard of. Yet here he was, and Daphne found herself fighting back tears. What had brought him back after all these years? Territory disputes with younger males? Curiosity? Or something more profound? Some memory of safety or connection that had drawn him to the one place where humans had shown him kindness. They remained in this strange tableau for several long minutes. The elderly woman and the wild bobcat, separated by mere inches of cold air, connected by years of unseen history. Then, Kamba did something even more extraordinary. He deliberately lowered himself to a sitting position on the windowsill, tucked his paws beneath him, and settled in as if preparing to stay. A choked laugh escaped Daphne's throat. In all her decades working with wildcats, she'd never witnessed behavior like this from a healthy, free-living bobcat. It defied everything she knew about their instincts and natural wariness. "You can't stay there," she told him softly. "It's too cold, and you're getting snowed on." As if understanding her concern, Kamba blinked slowly, then stood and stepped delicately over the window's edge into her room. Daphne's heart nearly stopped. Every conservation instinct screamed at her that this was dangerous, inappropriate, against all her own protocols. Yet she couldn't bring herself to chase him away. Not when he'd come so far, defied so many natural instincts to reach her. Kamba surveyed the room cautiously, nose working as he took in the unfamiliar scents. He avoided looking directly at Daphne now, instead conducting a methodical inspection of his surroundings. His movements were careful, controlled, no hint of aggression or fear, just watchful curiosity. After circling the room once, he approached a framed photograph on Daphne's dresser and paused. Daphne followed his gaze and felt her heart twist. It was a picture of her and David, taken during Kamba's rehabilitation. In it, they stood before his training enclosure, smiling proudly as the young Bobcat lurked half-hidden in the background. "You remember him too, don't you?" Daphne whispered. Kamba turned to look at her then, and something in his steady gaze seemed to reach straight into her soul. Without thinking, Daphne slowly extended her hand, palm up, stopping well short of actually touching him. For a breathless moment, Kamba studied her outstretched hand. Then, in a gesture that nearly stopped Daphne's heart, he stepped forward and briefly, so briefly she might have imagined it, pressed his forehead against her palm before retreating. The touch lasted less than a second, but it shattered something inside Daphne, some dam that had held back emotions she'd suppressed for years. Tears spilled freely down her cheeks as she sank to her knees on the floor, overwhelmed. Kamba watched her from a safe distance, seemingly neither distressed by her tears nor compelled to comfort her. He was, after all, still a wild animal, no matter this unprecedented behavior. After a few minutes, he turned and jumped lightly back to the windowsill, looking out into the snowy night. Understanding that he was ready to leave, Daphne rose shakily to her feet and opened the window wider. "Thank you for coming back," she told him, voice thick with emotion. "I've always wondered if you were all right out there." Kamba paused one last time, looking back at her over his shoulder. Their eyes met in a final moment of connection, wild animal and human caretaker, linked by an improbable bond that defied explanation. Then, as silently as he'd arrived, Kamba leapt from the windowsill into the snowy darkness and was gone. When Daphne recounted the experience to Miguel the next morning, she half expected him to think she'd dreamed the entire encounter. But the Bobcat's paw print remained on her window glass, and fresh tracks in the snow traced his path from the forest edge to the cabin and back again. "It's incredible," Miguel acknowledged, examining the tracks. "But not impossible. Bobcats are territorial. They maintain the same hunting grounds for years if they can. He might have been living nearby all this time. But to approach like that, to come inside." Daphne shook her head in wonder. "In 40 years of rehabilitation work, I've never seen anything like it." The encounter changed something in Daphne. As winter gave way to spring, she found herself filled with renewed purpose and energy. The hip that had pained her seemed less troublesome as she threw herself into expanding the sanctuary's educational programs and mentoring Jesse more intensively. "You seem different lately," Dr. Chen remarked during a routine visit to check on the recovering lynx. "More alive," Daphne suggested with a smile. "I feel it." Throughout that spring and summer, Daphne occasionally glimpsed what she believed was Kamba patrolling the boundaries of the sanctuary property. He never again approached the buildings or sought direct contact. But sometimes, when she conducted her morning walks, she would catch sight of a bobcat watching from a distance before melting away into the underbrush. Each sighting felt like a gift, a reminder that her life's work had meaning beyond what she could measure or document. Somewhere in the wild forests of Montana, a bobcat who had once been a helpless orphan now lived free and strong, carrying with him some memory of human kindness that had drawn him back against all natural instinct. When winter returned and Daphne celebrated her 74th birthday, the sanctuary staff presented her with a special gift, a trail camera they had secretly installed at the forest edge, which had captured clear images of what was unmistakably Kamba making his regular rounds of the sanctuary perimeter. "He's been here all along," Jesse told her, eyes shining with excitement. "At least once a week, according to the timestamp data. Always at dawn, always following the same route. It's like he's checking on us." Daphne studied the photographs with tears in her eyes. Kamba looked magnificent, healthy, powerful, every inch the wild predator he was meant to be. And yet, he had chosen to maintain this strange, distant connection to the humans who had once saved his life. That night, alone in her room, Daphne looked out her window at the star-filled Montana sky and felt a profound sense of completion. Her life had not followed the path others had expected. Not the prestigious medical career, not even the conventional family that her parents had hoped for. Instead, she had built something unique and precious, a legacy of compassion that extended beyond human boundaries, touching the lives of creatures who would never understand the concept of gratitude, yet somehow embodied it in their continued existence. And in one extraordinary case, in one wild bobcat who remembered, that legacy had come full circle in a way she could never have imagined. "We did good, David," she whispered to the night. "We did good." As if in answer, a distant, raspy call echoed from the forest edge, the distinctive sound of a bobcat in the night. Whether it was Kamba or another of his kind made no difference. They were out there, living the wild lives they were born for, partly because of her choices, her sacrifices, her love. And that, Daphne reflected as she closed her curtains against the night, was the most incredible gift of all.